we have an excellent panel for the different type of hazards, preparing for future hazards, and this group of people represents flood, fire, extreme wind, extreme cold and extreme heat. So you're going to be listening to a wide variety of them, and we're going to go as shown on the screen, starting with Ed Hurst, and we'll go over to Chief Hoover and to Dr. Maidment and Dr. Wilhelmi. So with that, I'm not going to take any more time. Mr. Hurst is Energy Fellow at the University of Houston. Mr. Hurst, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Kishore. I appreciate it. And so as a non-engineer and non-scientist here, as the economist here, you guys need to listen to me, because if you don't have the money, you're not going to have any way to prepare. And so I predicted the failure of the Urcot grid in 2013. That has come about because of underinvestment. This has been directed completely out of Austin for the past 20 years. But these are problems that we see not just in Texas, but in the responses across the utility space, if you will. California, for example, severe underinvestment in infrastructure. And along the Gulf Coast, as we're talking about the impacts from hurricanes, many of the local utilities, the guys who bring the wires and the meters to your homes, they wait until a disaster comes along before they clear the trees off the wires. Why is that? Well, they can get federal funding for that, and it improves their bottom line because that's an expenditure that they did not undertake during the year or the prior year or the prior 5 or 6 years. And so this lack of attention to management is one of the things that comes on with the first page of a microeconomics textbook, where we're talking about moral hazard. And can you trust the corporations and the regulatory bodies to do what they're supposed to be doing? So let's talk a bit about Winter Storm Uri. Next slide. So Texas was warned in 2011. In 2011, we had a polar vortex. It came into the state. There was one death attributed directly to it. Urcot learned a small lesson about having a blackout across the Dallas Medical Center. And in the report, the 300-odd page report that was issued by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, Texas was warned. Shedding load, which is a euphemism for blackouts, in winter places lives and property at risk. We know this is a fact. And in Texas, under the Urcot area, which covers 85% of most of the residents, so 26 million out of the 29 million in Texas. The governor's office says there were more than 211 deaths directly related to Winter Storm Uri. Some media outlets are over 900. We know that the state suffered more than $100 billion in economic losses. Exxon is not going to be able to get everything back to gearing where it needs to be, the supply chain, the production, until the spring of 2022. For many of these plants, it doesn't matter whether the power's out for 10 minutes, 10 hours, or 10 days. It takes months to get everything back into place and operating normally. And Winter Storm Uri has had a greater impact economically and in terms of loss of life than Ida or Henri or any of the hurricanes so far this year. Next slide. So let's look at the characteristics of the Urcot market, because this is, we're Texas after all. For 8 of the past 10 years, for the generators, the revenues received have not covered costs. So if you look at it as an economist would, this is the shutdown rule for generators. The price received is less than the average total cost. They have not been able to earn a return on capital on average. And so over time, as we pointed out in 2013, you're going to see a lack of investment, a lack of reinvestment. Urcot is an electricity only market. And what that means is, well, might be a little too soon to, well, the Astros, for example, last two games have been kind of awful. But if the Astros were paid on an electricity only basis, only those 10 players taking the field would get a check. The rest of the guys on the bench would not be getting a check at all unless they were called into the game. And with Urcot, only those generators that are actually turning, spinning, tossing electricity into the grid aren't making any revenues. Those that are on the sidelines, and there are a lot of them on the sidelines from September to the next August, they don't receive any revenues. They have no incentive to maintain the equipment and be ready to go. They'll oil everything up in July, but here we are in August. Everybody knows they should be running in August. What we ran into with February was a situation where no one had invested to weatherize or winterize, even though we had all been warned about that following 2011. There were lots of hearings in Austin, but because no one earns a return for doing any kind of preparatory work or weatherization, there's no reason for them to do it. Next slide. And in fact, if anything, there's an incredible financial incentive not to weatherize. And so if we have, for example, Keyshore and I have 10 generation units around the state, and we generally run 7 of those year round. Keyshore, we just heard from Michael that there's going to be a polar vortex in 2 weeks. We need to get those other 3 plants up and running. Keisha's going to look at me and say, hey, let's go get a beer and talk about this, because if we don't get those plants up and running, we guarantee the price will go from the average of $35 a megawatt hour to more than $9,000 a megawatt hour. We'll make 5 years of revenues and 20 years of profits in the space of a week and a half. Ed, let's go have a beer and not go forward with this weatherization. I think you're mistaken, Ed. And that's an incentive to go the wrong way for our consumers. Next slide. So, Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Railroad Commission, we had Senate Bill 2 and Senate Bill 3 passed. In August of 2021, the PUC proposed adopting the recommendations out of the 2011 report, and then a 2012 recommendations made by a consulting group. That doesn't help the 200 plus people who died. In September 21, the Railroad Commission, in response to the request from the legislature, the requirement from the legislature that the natural gas infrastructure weatherize, has proposed that, we'll weatherize, but we'll give everybody the opportunity to opt out of it for just $150 application fee to get on an exception list. And so this doesn't look like it's going to be very fruitful or beneficial for the state. Next slide. And so FERC and NERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, have issued their interim staff report. It's essentially the same as what we had in 2011. You could do a search and replace on 2011, put 2021 in. And the key takeaways from the presentations made by FERC and the comments by the commissioners: number one, frustration with the lack of action. We all know that Urcot is not subject to federal regulation. The other grids, the Southwest Power Pool and MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, performed better than Urcot during the winter freeze. These grids did have issues. There's no question they had issues, but they responded in hours. It didn't take them days, and they're federally regulated. And the Texans have not quite figured out that reliability is really key to maintaining a stable grid in this state. They went for a so-called scarcity market, a so-called crisis market. And, we're stuck with the nightmare that we have probably for the next 2 or 3 years until the state leaders decide that generation companies should earn some sort of rate of return. Thank you.
Very good. I like the idea of making $9,000 per kilowatt hour, but it's well put, and you made a very good point that we trying to optimize everything, we lose the reliability that we need to work with. Well, put your questions in a Q&A, folks. We're going to continue with our panel. So the next one is Chief Hoover, who is Acting Fire Administration in United States Fire Administration, and she is going to talk about the fire coming into urban area. Chief Hoover, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. And I just want to thank Ed for setting the stage on my presentation as we're talking about utilities and wildfire. Utilities have been at the focus on the West Coast as it relates to wildfire. And in a state that's very near and dear to my heart in California, as many of you know, the utilities, that prevention work prior to has really been front and center on a need to address some of the wildfire issues. But quickly, I just want to set the tone here. Again, we're going to speak about wildfire. I'm going to talk briefly about the state of the art and then lessons learned. But to put it in perspective, something that's come out of the National Interagency Fire Center, which we affectionately call the NIFC, we have been in a level 5 or level 4 preparedness, the longest in the history of the NIFC, which means that our resources over a period of over 4 months have been in extreme use across the country, not just on the West Coast, but throughout the country, because those resources needed to address wildfire within the wildland-urban interface and in open spaces come from all over the United States. Next slide, please. So the state of art preparing for wildfire. So I want to start off with community involvement. That would be community interaction, involvement, and inclusion. This is a collaborative and coordinated effort across all levels of government, across all levels of the community. And that state of the art for preparedness is not just about emergency response and that framework, but also the community taking a look at being prepared for wildfire. And again, as I mentioned, wildfire is a national fire problem. It's not just west of the Rockies. We saw it this year as wildfire intruded areas such as New Jersey, Michigan, Minnesota, places that I think most folks would not be familiar with wildfire. They draw that conclusion when we talk about west of the Rockies. Also, within that technology space, there's a lot of uses being used with GIS that can be used at the local level as well as throughout the state and federal government. There's provisions and training to actually prepare not just emergency responders, but the community on wildfire. We mentioned earlier, I believe during the conversation about hurricane, the need to evacuate and what are some of those key points to prepare people for evacuation. Fire modeling, when you engage the community and having them understand their fire, the nature of fire within their community by being able to show them actual fire behavior on their landscaping, on their parcel-based information. And then the messaging that goes into all of that, whether it is in the emergency responder, situational awareness, or even in the community, making sure that the community has all of the information, that it's reliable, it's succinct, and provides up-to-date information for those. Next slide, please. So lessons learned, and unfortunately, we've had a lot of recent disasters to learn from. And I'm going to throw this out there. One community's emergency is another community's disaster. So when we think about scale and scope, when you talk about a couple 100 acres of fire on the landscape in a community, that couple 100 acres somewhere else is their disaster. That fire resonates not just in structures lost, lives lost, but also economic losses, watershed losses, landscaping. When we talk about more of a flat land, what is lost for agriculture and livestock. So we have a lot, unfortunately, we've had a lot of disasters to learn from. And what we found out is public education and awareness, again, that whole community approach is critical. We need to make sure that the public is aware of the wildfire risk, that it is real, and then how they can prepare for that. Prevention measures. Those prevention measures can be as simple as vegetation clearance, and I don't mean clear cutting. I mean practical vegetation clearance away from structures that reduce the effects of ember intrusion, reduce the effect of flame on a structure, but also to things like ceiling openings, removing furniture from underneath the decks, et cetera, but some simple prevention measures up to better construction techniques in areas. I mentioned the whole community approach. Again, this is whole community across government. That means engaging our public and engaging our public for the long haul. Partnerships and preparedness, no one can do this alone. Those partnerships at a non-government entity all the way up to government entities, understanding what is available for the community, cross-communication, having those partners at the table. Fire service is important to have at the table when community planners are planning out structure locations, roadway settings, where to put community neighborhoods. The fire service should be at that table with planners, with building officials. And also, understanding that it's not when will it happen, not the question of if it will happen, but when will it happen? And are we prepared for it? Again, when we look across the last 5 years, we've had wildfire impact communities in areas that we would have never expected. And if we go back a little further to Gatlinburg, who would have thought that Gatlinburg would have had the incident they had? That was a devastating fire for them or for any community. Next slide, please. I mentioned the emergency response community. Again, that a national incident management system. Why do we use a national incident management system? I mentioned it earlier that resources come from all over the country. Here in Maryland, resources were sent to California, to Michigan, to Minnesota, to Florida, to Texas. Texas sends resources to other areas of the community. California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado send resources to other areas in the country as well. And so we all need to be working off of the same platform and understanding each other when we do respond. Also, what are the available resources in your community? Again, planning for the wildfire, very similar to when we plan for hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, being able to identify the resources in your community. And can they get up and operating quickly? We used to say a 48-hour on your own. We tell people now you're in excess of 72 hours of potentially being without power or that running water that we're so used to. Other lessons learned, building and fire codes make an impact. And that is sometimes a difficult conversation for a community, but that is all part of building a resilient community for all hazards, all disasters. And practice makes perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And so having those tabletop exercises, bringing the communities together, bringing neighborhoods together to practice what they will do in the event of a disaster, in the event of an emergency, evacuation, what that would look like, what messaging would look like, and how we communicate with each other so that we are clear and concise in that communication. I put a note at the bottom of the slide there that says almost 90% of wildfires in the United States are caused by people. So to me, that speaks to behavior, the need to change behavior, whether it's how we look at wildfire, wildland-urban interface, how we interact and engage in preparing for it, or what we do when we respond to and mitigate for. Next slide, please. One of the areas that I think many communities are starting to fully engage in is that community risk reduction model. And when I speak to community risk reduction, many of your fire departments are engaged in community risk reduction at a level down to the weeds here, no pun intended, but it's really about getting ready, assessing your hazards, planning for those, implementing, and looking at those results. This is a repeat and perform model, and this involves every aspect of the community. And finally, the last slide. There's a number of information available at the United States Fire Administration as well as FEMA, information on mitigation grants that are available, as well as information that will help your emergency responders be prepared for wildfire. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you. It was great. Don't forget to put your questions in Q&A. We're going to continue with the presentation by the panelists. So the next one is Dr. Maidment, Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Maidment, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in the discussion today. And I want to thank the other panelists for their contributions, and especially also thank Hanadi Rafai and the wonderful leadership that she's making in the Hazard Center at the University of Houston. So I'm going to be talking about floods, and can you go to the next slide, please? So there is a new national flood forecasting system for the United States that has been developed at the National Water Center, which has been established on the Tuscaloosa campus of the University of Alabama by the National Weather Service and federal agency partners. And this has the mission to assess hydrology in a new way at a continental scale for the whole country. And so Michael Coyne spoke about the West Gulf River Forecast Center and the other regional forecast centers that you can see shown in this map with red dots. And the star in Alabama is intended to be a national center for flooding, like what the National Hurricane Center is in Miami, and it's been going now for a few years, seeking to achieve that goal. Can you go to the next slide, please? At the beginning of the National Water Center, which was about in 2014, a proposal was made to quick start the whole process by building a prototype of what was now called the National Water Model in the academic community. And that was done at the Texas Advanced Computing Center on this facility called Stampede. It is the largest academic supercomputer in the country. And this tank, 1.2 million gallons cooling tank, just outside my office window, that cools Stampede in the afternoon. Lots of people contributed to that. The National Science Foundation supports Stampede, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research contributed the analysis framework that was used in developing the National Water Model. Next, please. The model became operational in 2016, and now water is like weather. It's forecast everywhere all the time. And so there are several different versions of the forecast model. There's a 3-hour, we'll call it an analysis and assimilation model that essentially reconstructs what's going on today. There's an 18-hour short-range forecast for flash flooding and so on. There's a 10-day medium-range forecast for looking further ahead. And then there's a 30-day long-range forecast that's more for drought conditions. And this forecasts flow on 2.7 million stream reaches in the continental United States. About 100,000 of those are in Texas, and they forecast flows on about 190,000 miles of streams and rivers in our state. Next, please. So then we had Hurricane Harvey. So Hurricane Harvey had an enormous impact on Texas, and especially on Southeast Texas and the Houston area. It came ashore as a Category 4 hurricane, the first that's been recorded in the central Texas coast, at 10 o'clock on Friday, the 25th of August, 2017. And you can see the colors here. The orange is Category 4 hurricane, and the blue is tropical storm. So it came ashore, it wandered around a little bit inside of Texas, then it went back out into the Gulf again and came ashore again 5 days later on Wednesday, the 30th of August. And all the time while that was happening, the counterclockwise winds around the hurricane were sweeping moisture in off of the Gulf. And that's why there was such a catastrophic rainfall that occurred in Hurricane Harvey. Next, please. This chart shows the amount of rain that fell in Hurricane Harvey. The vertical axis has the amount of rain that fell, and the horizontal axis is the area that it fell on. The blue dots represent the most intense previous storms that have ever happened in the history of the United States. And the orange line is Harvey. So Harvey had the worst precipitation, the most precipitation ever recorded in US history for 2 days. For 3 days, it was 125 millimeters more, or about 5 inches more. And for 5 days, it was 280 millimeters more than the previous worst storms, which is 11 inches more. And that means that the orange line was on average 11 inches above the blue dots. So we saw Harvey as really what's called probable maximum precipitation, a maximum event that could happen in this area. Next, please. When Harvey was going on, the National Water Model was operating. And on the left-hand side, what you see is a 10 days ahead forecast of the precipitation that was anticipated while the hurricane was still out in the Gulf. And on the right-hand side, you can see the actual rainfall that fell. So the left-hand side is the 10 days ahead medium range forecast. The right-hand side is the analysis and assimilation model. And you can see how similar those are. And it's really a remarkable achievement that a forecast 10 days ahead while the hurricane was still out in the Gulf was sufficient to be able to depict the flow. Next, please. Oh, there we are. That's fine. So one of the things that we had done in our research program was to be able to connect the National Water Model with the count of the number of address points that are flooded. And address points are recorded on every house so that when you dispatch an emergency operation to go to a house, the first responders know where to go. And this is a calculation, actually, I made this calculation at 3 o'clock on the day that Harvey came ashore. And in Region 2, which is the TDM, Texas Division of Emergency Management Region for Southeast Texas, it was estimated that there would be 238,000 address points flooded. And Region 6, which is to the left, about 22,000 address points flooded. And you could see there was just no doubt at all that Houston was going to get creamed. And this is a remarkable thing because Harvey came ashore in Corpus Christi, 165 miles to the southwest. But just because of the forecast that I showed you previously, you can see that the fact that Harvey was going to impact Houston was already known. I think that's actually a pretty remarkable capacity for being able to look forward to assessing the impact of such a major disaster. Next, please. The impact in Houston was catastrophic. So 210,000 buildings were flooded. This is the data from the city of Houston. The flooding covered 64% of the area of the city of Houston. The gray area shows buildings that were flooded outside the mapped flood zones, 58% of them. The light blue area for inside the 100-year flood zone, 23%, and 19% between the 100 and 500-year flood zone. And what that meant was that Harvey was just such a catastrophic event that it overwhelmed any previous calculation that we had of what the impact of flooding would be in the city of Houston. Next, please. So I was asked to address 3 questions. One of them is, are increases in flood severity and frequency anticipated? And I have to say that I don't know the answer to that question. Mike Coyne mentioned the idea of storm intensification, and you can imagine that as the ocean warms through global warming, that the capacity for generating high intensity storms will increase, but I can't say that I've investigated that to a very great degree, so I don't want to comment on that question. What are recent models and tools? I think the National Water Model is a tremendous innovation. I've been a hydrologist all my life, and we've always thought about hydrology as a bottom-up kind of an exercise, starting with local watersheds and always looking at everything from a small-scale perspective. And now hydrology is also top-down from the continental scale. So in other words, we're thinking about water being just like weather. And it's almost like we in hydrology have sort of tipped ourselves upside down, and we're now looking from the top down rather than from the bottom up. But I think that's really important, because connecting cause and effect is really an important aspect here. And the third question that I was asked to address is, what are the gaps in knowledge? And I would say that linking coastal, riverine, and direct rainfall-based flooding is still a developing area. We're not really very good at that. And the impact of Harvey on Houston is a really good illustration of that, there was a substantial impact of just rain that fell directly on top of the city. And it's not just about flooding from the creeks, it's also about flooding that just rises in local areas. Another question is how to deal with the complexities of urban areas. I think the National Water Model is a great achievement in itself, but if you think about the city of Houston is almost so complex that it needs another urban water model, just as complex as the national water model, to track the movement of water within the urban area. And finally, linking the physical impact of flooding with social vulnerability. The areas of the city, it matters where flooding happens. The northeast part of Houston is different than the southwest part of Houston. And I think that's an area where we need to think more carefully about how we can understand what the impact of flooding is. So there we are. That's the summary of my contribution on the impacts of flooding.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maidment. I think you made very good, in a concise manner, all the important aspects of the flooding is where we need to go in the years to come. One of the things I forgot to mention when we started the panel and the session is that the biodata of all the speakers are in the TAMEST website. Given that, we're going to go to the last presentation of the panel by Dr. Wilhelmi. She is a research scientist at National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. It's all yours, Dr. Wilhelmi.
Okay, thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and participate in this panel. So I will be talking about extreme heat and covering some of the questions regarding what have been accomplished in terms of our understanding and preparing for extreme heat, as well as some of the gaps in research and practice. Next slide, please. So we are talking today about extreme heat because it has significant implications for public health and economy. Heat is one of the deadliest weather hazards in the US, and there is growing evidence that the risks associated with heat-related mortality are increasing, as well as the risks associated with hospital admissions, acute and chronic health effects also increasing. And although there have been less research that's been done on the economic impacts of heat compared to the health impact of heat, there's also growing evidence that heat can cost US economy billions of dollars through premature mortality, healthcare costs, and the reduced or lost productivity. Even just in the recent survey, we have seen in the summer of 2020 that 13% of Americans lost productivity due to heat, due to in the summer months, and those kind of numbers could translate into significant economic losses. We also know from numerous studies that these risks, both health risks and economic risks, may vary across regions. among different demographic and socioeconomic groups and throughout the summer season. We have seen some significant progress in both statistical, epidemiological models in predicting risks, analyzing spatial distribution of risks. And for example, some of the figures that I've included here on the slide shows some of the novel methods for modeling heat health risks in Houston, Texas. Some of those predict the number of heat-related 911 calls throughout the summer seasons and the relevant temperature or heat index thresholds, as well as some of the novel methods to estimate heat-related mortality from heat exposure indoors, especially in the homes of the older adults in Houston, Texas. Next slide, please. There's also growing evidence that the urban areas are particularly vulnerable to heat. Urban population is growing nationwide and in Texas. Cities also across the world and across the country are warming faster than rural areas. And numerous studies have shown that the urban heat island effect continues to contribute to increased exposure to heat for the urban residents. Something that we have seen a significant progress in understanding the relationship between built environment and climate, although urban environments are incredibly complex and there is a lot more work that needs to be done in understanding urban meteorology and the response of different urban structures to extreme heat events. But also progress has been made in measuring, modeling, and mapping intra-urban distribution of heat. And for example, one of the recent urban heat mapping campaign in Houston provided detailed information about the urban heat island effects in the city and shows the huge difference in temperature between different neighborhoods because of the characteristics of the built environment. One of the recent area of research that's currently been growing is due to recognizing that people spend almost 90% of their time indoors. And so some of the recent and ongoing studies have been focusing on the interaction between outdoor and indoor environments, looking at building design characteristics as well as building management and occupant behavior. And the linkages between all of those different characteristics to indoor heat exposure and the health risks associated with those exposures. And this work is also growing, and it's important in light of increasing concern about power outages, and especially reliance on the mechanical air conditioning in most of the buildings in the US. And that's not only in terms of increased demand for cooling, but also due to potential disruptions to air conditioning due to other severe weather events. And so recent research have been started to looking at what does it mean for passive survivability of buildings in the event of prolonged power outages, giving different construction materials, different climates, and how long would it take for buildings to become overheated to produce heat stress for their occupants. But in general, a lot more work that's needed in this area. It's a fairly complex area to incorporate building science, climate science, and social science to look at this intersection between built environment, health, and climate. Next slide, please. So we cannot talk about extreme heat without talking about equity and social vulnerability. There's a large body of knowledge, and this body of knowledge is growing about systemic vulnerabilities to heat in under-resourced communities. Low income, housing instability, energy insecurity, and health inequities all contribute to negative heat health effects. For example, recent national survey showed that 20% of Americans who have air conditioning in their homes cannot use it effectively due to high cost of electricity and other financial barriers. And also our research in Houston showed that 20% of older adults feel too hot in their homes. So all of those things definitely need to be considered when we think about preparing for heat and responding to heat. Also, research shows that the number of heat vulnerable population is increasing, and those include people who are 65 and older, people with pre-existing health conditions, and may require special attention during heat emergencies. Overall, the research on heat vulnerability is growing, and that's happening through development of some of the novel frameworks, methods, and also decision support tools that help identify individual factors of heat risk and vulnerability, as well as looking at the hotspots where in cities and the countries, some of those factors intersect to produce the hotspot of heat risk. But generally speaking, much more work has been done on understanding exposure and sensitivity to extreme heat, and less work on understanding the behavioral aspects of heat risk. So we have growing knowledge, but it's still limited knowledge on adaptive capacity, coping capacity, social capital, risk perception, community resources, role of institution, as well as occupational health. And considering those factors are extremely important, not only for understanding extreme heat health effects, but also for preparedness, for more targeting warnings, and also for risk communication, especially when we need to reach out to more vulnerable population. Next slide, please. So climate change plays an important role also in heat preparedness and response. Now it is virtually certain that hot extremes, which includes heat waves, have become more frequent and more intense across most land regions in the world. And also recent studies shows that the extreme heat events are increasing, and the heat season is becoming longer in most US cities. There's some new studies now that shows attribution to heat-related death to human-caused climate change. And also climate change projections show that exposure of the US population to heat is going to increase, given the projected increase in average temperature, summertime temperature variability, and the frequency of hot days and nights. And that also not just important for the thinking about how we're going to be adapting to climate in this kind of warmer world, but also what is the role of heat warnings, advisories, what they may look like if more than half of the summer months is going to be reaching the current thresholds that would warrant heat warnings and advisories. And one area that's also growing attention is related to compounding hazards and intersecting vulnerabilities, because heat risks often has to be considered in the context of other climate extremes, whether it's smoke from wildfires, urban air pollution, drought, or extreme weather events and tropical storms that can disrupt power grid or produce unhealthy air qualities that would prevent people from, let's say, opening windows. And so all of those have to be considered both in a context of preparedness and response, because some of those extreme events also projected to change with climate change. Next slide.
Very good. You covered a lot of material in a very short time. Thank you very much. Well, we have some questions on Q&A. One of the questions that is overarching for all the speakers is, what is the one or maybe two things that is missing in the hazards that you talked about that we can focus on in the years to come? And I'll start with Ed Hertz.
You know, it's not that we don't recognize the hazards, it's how we prepare for them. And so as we saw with Ida going through South Louisiana, it was much more of a wind event. And you know, the grid infrastructure was not prepared for 150 mile an hour winds. South Florida, of course, had that issue with Hurricane Andrew some years ago, and rebuilt to a much stronger, higher standard. It's a question of really political integrity, political leadership. No politician likes to raise taxes or increase expenditures. That's a ticket for not being reelected. And so it's this political economy question that we're facing. You know, much more than the engineering or the science, we know what we need to do. I mean, you know, utilities across Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, El Paso, they weatherized, they went through Winter Storm Uri with few disruptions. Every utility in Texas knows what they need to do. There's just no political willpower or the willingness of the consumer or the voter to pay for it. Not yet, anyway.
Chief Hoover, do you have some thought? And I have to admit that, you know, I really have not thought much about fire. So educate me. You're muted. Chief Hoover, you're.
I have to find the mute button. I think a lot of people haven't thought about fire because they see fire as being a norm, right? And we have to get past that fire is a norm. It is still one of the leading disasters affecting our country across the spectrum. And so I'll go back to something that Ed said, and it is the political willpower to address all hazards. And what does that mean? What is our community's acceptable risk? And that goes across, when I say community, that means the people living in the community. What is that level of acceptable risk? And is it losing half of a community to wildfire? Is it a devastation of the landscape, of the watershed? So it is the political will to engage.
Excellent. Dr. Maidment.
Thank you. So I think a great challenge is the connection of technology with the capacity to do response. And I've worked closely with the Austin Fire Department, with Harry Evans, who's former Chief of Staff of the Austin Fire Department, and he's really educated me as to what it takes to be a first responder. And so science is one thing, and the capacity to respond and save people's lives is another. And the first response community is a crucial piece of putting all that together. So I think translating all this great stuff that I was talking about into knowledge that can be used for improving our response in real time would be a very important thing.
Dr. Wilhelmi, you're muted. There you go.
So one of the approach in a more effective response is to engage communities in the dialogue. And so there are some examples that show that interdisciplinary research that also engages community members and a strong partnership with communities that can really help us understand what are the needs and how we can better tailor our science and decision support tools and different methods to reach those that are most vulnerable.
Well, you know, that particular question really brought out what is summarizes in a way for all hazards, that we really have quite a bit of knowledge available, but we have not been able to convince the community, the people, so that they would either vote to spend the money needed or vote to go to political system at the local level, at the state level, and how we can prevent the disaster.